This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. The weekly wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Cricket, first up, Claire. And craziness in Parliament. Then we get into that ceasefire deal between Israel and Lebanon.
Yep, and then we're going to talk about a big report into domestic violence that came out this week. You might have missed that. It was from the Northern Territory, followed by the retirement of one of the greatest ever swimmers.
And we'll talk to all the stats around her achievements. Let's get into it. Cricket, Claire, was the biggest story of the week because we lost, and we lost bad.
We lost really bad.
So bad.
Most Googled search term of the week too around
Just
the
cricket?
Australian cricket.
Just like what happened?
And we know what was behind it. Yeah, it was this bad loss.
We had it on over the weekend in our house. And I rely on my husband to tell me sort of what's going on. Like, I'm interested in the cricket, but I sort of say to him, like, you know, where's it up to?
Yeah.
What's going on? Every time I asked him, he just mumbled something that I couldn't decipher. And so I got the gist pretty quick that things weren't going that well.
And it wasn't a mumble of joy, clearly, that things were going so well.
No.
One of our worst ever defeats on home soil.
Yeah, I saw that headline too. The reason to call it out is that the cicadas are out, Claire, in my neck of the woods. The humidity is here.
Or as I say, cicadas.
Yeah, cicadas.
I don't know. I keep getting tricked. It's one of those words. We've all got words we can't say. That's one of mine.
I think in Victoria they might say cicadas, or it's a
who
bit
knows?
weird. The cicadas are out, the humidity is here, and so is the cricket. It's summer.
Yep.
Summer is upon us. Second test starts this coming Friday in Adelaide. It needs to be good from the Aussies.
It really does. But one door opens, Kate, another door closes. Parliament is done. Done and dusted for the year.
To call the last sitting week for the federal parliament frenetic is a bit of an understatement. It was wild. It was crazy, as we said in the headlines. It got to the last day of the sitting calendar for the year, and there were 36 pieces of legislation to get through the Senate. To do that, they had to bring out the guillotine. It's official, this thing.
The good old guillotine. So it's a motion that you bring into...
Like it's actually a thing.
No,
yeah.
it's not a physical
not
bit
a
of
physical
equipment,
thing,
but it is a thing. Yeah, for sure. So it's a motion the government can bring on. Debate is cut off. It's not that the government brings out a machine that has a heavy blade and beheads people. They don't quite go that far.
But it just doesn't limit the time you can debate something so that they can get all this stuff
Get
through.
it done.
Yeah, gotcha.
Hence, lots of calls as we get into Thursday and Friday around shutting down debate. And there were some big bills, big complicated bills, things around privacy and the role of the Reserve Bank, things about all sorts of parts of privacy and electoral reforms. They shut down debate pretty quickly so they, as you said, could get all of those bits of legislation dealt with.
If this was a politics podcast, we'd go into a lot of them.
Totally.
But we were just here to sort of give you the stuff that's probably been in the news the most and that you would have seen across the week. And that really was the social media ban legislation.
Yep. Absolutely. So world's first legislation. Labor and the Coalition backed that bill, and essentially its purpose is to make the social media platforms, so we're talking about TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, Reddit, X, Instagram, they would be liable for fines of up to $50 million in Australian dollars if they failed to prevent young people from signing up to accounts.
So under 16, 16's the age, as we know. How it works and will work is still in question, though. The platforms have a year to work out how to implement the age restriction before those penalties that you talked about are enforced. One thing they won't be allowed to do is compel users to provide government-issued identity. So you won't have to have a ID card that you then submit.
Yeah, like a copy of your passport or your driver's license or something like that.
I'm thinking about 16, like what would they have? Like a student card?
Yeah,
I don't
some
know
sort of
what they
ID.
have. Yeah.
Well, clearly they won't have one.
They won't need it.
Which is kind
it's not
of
a
the
thing.
point. Yeah. So it goes to concerns, that bit around privacy. Early in the week, there was a small group of coalition MPs and senators who raised their concerns. They were particularly worried. They just weren't comfortable with the idea that Australians would have to hand over that sort of documentation to these social media platforms. And essentially not just young people either, all of us.
We'd all have to prove that we're not under the age of 16.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is that anyone in Australia would have to verify their age. We don't really know how it's all going to work. As you said, the details are still TBC.
Privacy isn't the only concern. Other criticisms include that the legislation has been rushed through the Parliament without adequate scrutiny, that it just won't work as well. Like, how is this actually going to work? And that kids are just going to find their way around these verification processes anyway.
Yep, something that Bryce Corbett talked about when it came to a radio interview he did with Ben Fordham this week. There's certainly a lot of conversation about kids just being savvy enough to get around whatever they do put up. Another one of these concerns that popped up is that it would take away the rights of parents to decide what's best for their children. That was from the more right-leaning coalition senators. They also raised these general concerns around censorship and whether it's appropriate for the government to censor any media for anyone in Australia.
For those that lean that way in politics, anything that says ban, is an automatic.
It's a red flag.
It's an automatic red flag. Where my head goes with all of this is what, and you kind of touched on it, but what constitutes a social media platform? Like, I think we across the news this week, it's just like social media platforms. But like, what are we actually referring to here? Some of the ones you mentioned, and so I looked into this.
Yep.
Some of the ones you mentioned, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, X, Reddit, are platforms that the government's mentioned will definitely be covered under this legislation. The definition in the legislation is that a social network is defined as any online service that has a significant purpose of enabling online social interactions between two or more users. It's about that exchange between people, that social element. The laws, though, will give the Minister for Communications, who is currently Michelle Rowland, the right to rule platforms in or out. So, for example, she's already said this week, YouTube won't be included as part of these bans.
Yeah, plenty say it's very murky and could be quite arbitrary. So Bryce Corbett, again, he made the point on radio that there are so many apps that adults haven't heard of.
He listed some and I can't even remember them.
Whisper.
Never heard of it.
Twitch is one. I've definitely heard of Twitch. Essentially, these are a lot of the platforms around gaming and interactive gaming. They're big platforms where kids do communicate, and there are all sorts of things that can happen on those sites as well.
In case you have no idea who Bryce Corbett is, he's the director of Squiz Kids. We've talked about him a bit, but you know what? You might
Everyone knows Bryce, surely.
Bryce Corbett.
Just assume that.
Zoe Daniels, who's a Teal MP from Melbourne, said the true object of this legislation, and this is her quote, is not to make social media safe by design, but to make parents and voters feel like the government is doing something about it.
Yeah, the good old someone's done something, so we've ticked that box and move on. That's certainly Zoe Daniels' view. You couldn't say that she's from the right. She's a very prominent former ABC journalist, so she's just got a very different view about all of this. She really wants to see something that will work. Also, of course, when it comes to parents and what they will want, you can't blame them for wanting something.
It's interesting. For every critic, there's a parent out there going, "Oh, great!
Yeah,
I get to tell my kids you're not allowed."
Yeah, the police might come and find you.
That seems nice. And as a parent myself, I'm like, well, that sounds like, it's actually illegal. That sounds like an easy way out. But also, I mean, the issue around banning something and how to actually go about that. Well, this is going to play out across the coming year. Claire, probably the other thing to note was some very shouty people in the Senate. Pauline Hanson, Fatima Payman and Lydia Thorpe. Scenes. Lots of
angry scenes. And look, I'll try to be brief because this is probably the stuff that just makes eyes roll when it comes to the behaviour in our parliament from time to time. But if you did see something, that there was something happening with those women and you want to know what it's all about, here we go. There was a very heated scene in the Senate on Wednesday. Hanson was trying to table documents. She said that it questioned Senator Payman's eligibility to sit in the parliament because she was born in Afghanistan. What Payman responded with, and this is the quote, "Someone bring in the dictionary because Senator Hanson does not know the definition of racism." She was forced to withdraw that comment. That's unparliamentary language. And then Lydia Thorpe got involved.
Who's another senator?
Another senator. So Thorpe repeatedly yelled out that Hanson was a convicted racist. She ripped up the documents that Hanson was trying to table. She threw them at Pauline Hanson, and then she flipped them the bird.
Yeah.
And left the chamber, and that saw her suspended until the end of the week.
It was quite, scenes is really the only way to describe it. If you haven't seen the clip, just Google Lydia Thorpe and you can watch it. But what it means is that she couldn't vote on anything and she is completely suspended from the parliament till the end of the week. It didn't stop her from going into the gallery of the Senate, though, where the media sit. She yelled from there on Thursday. I don't know, what was she yelling?
She was yelling pro-Palestine slogans.
Okay.
She was also yelling at Hanson about being a racist. It was a whole thing.
It's, not a way that most people are able to behave in their workplace. So It was quite something. As for other legislation, we'll call out two others. As you say, there was so much, but we'll call out two others. The Help to Buy scheme, that's a shared equity scheme where the Commonwealth co-owns properties with those who are buying them to help low-income earners get on the housing market. It's a bit technical, when you look into exactly how that works. But, for example, it's only for 40,000 homes and you're only eligible if you earn up to $90,000 a year as an individual or $120,000 a year as a couple.
Yeah, so that legislation's been kicking around for quite some time, and what the Albanese government said is the Greens have held it up for ages. There could have been thousands more people getting into homes by now, but they certainly welcomed the Greens' support to get that legislation done.
Because the opposition was very against it.
Yeah, the coalition wasn't having a bar of it. The other one to call out is the HECS indexation bill. That's passed as well. So that means that 3 million Australians have $3 billion wiped from their student debt. I hope one person doesn't have $3 billion. That would be a lot of study.
What? You would be so qualified.
They've done like 1 million courses.
I think it's the end of the year. That really cracks me up, though. No, you would be the most qualified person in the world if you had $3 billion in debt. As for anything else, in order to get all this passed, Parliament sat very, very late on Thursday night, and come Friday, we've been able to wrap this all up. We won't see Parliament again until February 2025. Three other bits of news to wrap up. Hard to pick this week what to actually dive into, but it's certainly that ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon is one to call out.
Yeah, so there's been 13 months of fighting between Israel and the Lebanese terror group Hezbollah. That ceasefire deal was brokered by the US and France. US President Joe Biden told reporters that it's designed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities.
Well, that's a big deal because permanent is permanent. That's supposed to be forever. That's supposed to be the end of it. It's not for a few days or for a few weeks while they sort through things. It's supposed to be permanent. It's tricky because the agreement is with the governments of Israel and Lebanon, but not with Hezbollah. And I actually spoke to Adam Harvey about this in my News Club chat. He's a former foreign correspondent and has spent time in Israel. If you haven't caught that interview, he explained that the truth of Lebanon is that, yes, Lebanon has a government, but Hezbollah really is the government and they are the most powerful.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating place, and definitely urge you to have a listen to that News Club episode. It's a really good one. So the agreement states that the Lebanese government will prevent Hezbollah and all other armed groups in the territory of Lebanon from carrying out any operations against Israel. Hezbollah didn't participate directly in any of those talks on the ceasefire. It's not them who has signed it either, but the Speaker of Lebanon's parliament was the one who mediated on the group's behalf.
It's a lot of politics. And just to point out on top of that, Iran, which is Hezbollah's ally, they were in support of the deal. So layer that on top.
Tick, yeah.
The politics are complicated, but Hezbollah and Israel do seem to have a ceasefire deal in place, however which way it's came about. Before we move on to what Israel's required to do, let's finish on the Lebanese side of the border. The basis of the deal is the full implementation without violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. We're getting a bit technical here, but we kind of need to. which ended the last war in 2006. That's what ended the last war in 2006. That's important to understand.
Yeah, we're not taking you down a weird rabbit hole, we promise. It's actually quite an important point to clock in all of this. And it's important because almost 2 decades of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah never really stopped in 2006. There's always been some tensions going on there. It's what it's all about. The UN resolution required, amongst other things, that Hezbollah remove its fighters and weapons from an area between the blue line. So that's a sort of unofficial border between Lebanon and Israel. There's the Litani River, which is about 30 kilometres to the north, and this line that is the Israel border. So Israel said that it was never implemented, and what Hezbollah did was actually build within that zone extensive infrastructure in that area.
And then on the other side, this isn't a one-way grievance, I guess. Lebanon says Israel also violated the resolution by making military flights over its territory. Here they are, though, with a ceasefire agreement that adheres to that UN resolution from 2006, or appears to.
They've agreed to do that. So that's really, really significant. As for Israel, it's agreed to withdraw Israeli forces from southern Lebanon within 60 days. It seems like a long time to me, but anyway, that's what they've agreed. Ongoing, it says that it won't carry out any offensive military operations against Lebanese targets, and that includes civilian, military and other state targets in the territory of Lebanon. That's the official language. It's a really big, comprehensive ceasefire.
Yeah, and from here, I guess the conversation turns to, and the question turns to, whether there's any chance of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
That's the hope. So what Joe Biden said is that the United States is going to make another really big push as this week ends and as we get into next week. He will do that with the regional powers. There have been quite a few, of course, regional powers involved in all of this. But when it comes to Gaza, certainly wrangling all of them again to push for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. That would involve the release of hostages that were taken from Israel on the 7th of October last year. Hamas has said this week that it's open to a ceasefire, but they're still rejecting a lot of the conditions that Israel wants to put on that, including their removal from power.
So we sort of put that one in the pending tray.
Yeah, for sure.
Moving on, a bit of news this week which didn't get a lot of cut through in a very busy week dominated by cricket and Parliament pretty much, was the Northern Territory's coroner's report on the death of 4 Aboriginal women linked to domestic violence. That came about after what, if you read across the news, they're saying is a groundbreaking investigation.
Yeah, and they're calling it groundbreaking because it bundled together 4 cases and they looked at the circumstances of their death, these women's death, and then they made some very big recommendations for the government and police to overhaul their approach when it comes to dealing with family and domestic violence, ultimately to stop women and children being killed.
Yeah, 35 recommendations in total. We'll talk about them in a moment. But before we do, let's give you the background on the prevalence of domestic violence in the Northern Territory. We've talked about it a bit this year when we've discussed the issues around Alice Springs. The NT has the highest rates of domestic, family and sexual violence in the country. The rate of intimate partner homicide is 7 times that of the national average.
Yeah, it's pretty stunning, isn't it? And when you zero in on Aboriginal women, there were 82 Aboriginal women killed in domestic violence attacks since the year 2000. And during this inquest, the Northern Territory Police said that they've recorded a 117% increase in the number of those domestic, family and sexual violence calls in the past decade. So the problem's getting a lot worse.
Yeah, and they've also predicted that without a radical change, that's their language, they would see a further 73% increase in the next 10 years. So to the radical change, Coroner Elizabeth Armitage said she did not believe any of her 35 recommendations were actually all that radical. She said they're things the sector have been calling on for many, many years.
Yeah, and herein lies the frustration. She was quite emotional when she was talking about it and when she was delivering her findings on Monday. She even allowed the television cameras to come in and film and also broadcast it live, which is very, very rare. She called for the national media to pay a lot better attention. She called it a national shame, those very high domestic violence rates in the Northern Territory.
So here we are talking about it. To the 35 recommendations, as I said, we'd come back to those. She called for a significant funding boost to services. She says the sector needs a peak body in the NT to spearhead advocacy and keep pushing for change. She wants to see more funding for alcohol and drug rehabilitation and the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, and that's because more than 15% of the Northern Territory population speak an Aboriginal language at home.
I don't think I quite realised
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was one of the really big issues that she called out, that a lot of these women actually need those interpreter services to ask for the right help at the right time. On the law and order side, what she said was she wanted police to dedicate a lot more resources to dealing with domestic family sexual violence in Alice Springs and Darwin. They needed a lot more boots on the ground for that. All of the recommendations come back to this very uncomfortable truth, which is that all of 4 of the women that she zeroed in on, their cases, they had asked for help. They'd either reported violence to the police or they'd told their loved ones that there were issues in the days, weeks or months before they were killed.
And that's not the end of it either. Judge Armitage also announced she would hold a second major inquiry in August next year. The details of that are still to be determined, but she noted that there have been 8 alleged domestic violence-related deaths in the past 5 months alone. Before we leave this, sorry to talk about News Club interviews again, but I feel like we kind of can't not. I did speak with the Mayor of Alice Springs a few weeks ago. It's just a 30-minute interview. You can hear his desperation and frustration about this issue as well, so I encourage you to have a listen to that. Changing gears for our third story.
Yeah, I think we can pick up the mood a little bit
we need
on
to.
a more positive note. So Emma McKeon, she announced her retirement from competitive swimming this week. She won more Olympic medals than any other Australian.
We knew this was her last Olympics, so, you know, it could have been a phased approach to her retirement. It wasn't like she sort of had told us that heading into the Olympics this year, but this is really the line in the sand. She's done. Let me talk in more detail about her achievements. 14 Olympic medals, including 6 golds, which is the most by any Aussie in Olympic history, and not just for swimming, and as an athlete.
Full stop, yeah.
20 medals at the Commonwealth Games, 14 gold there, 20 at World Championship events, 5 of those gold. And she's a many times over world record holder. Some of those records still stand.
Yeah, and I reckon many listening will have missed that news this week. It's been a really big news week, but I reckon many will be hearing this for the first time. I think that kind of has to do as well, not just a big news week. She's pretty low-key, Emma McKeon.
She's sort of very well known for being so low-key, like calm, cool, collected, never phased. And I think back to her emotional final swim, where she sort of broke down, talking about the fact that she
pressure was off.
She wouldn't be swimming anymore. And it's really interesting watching what she's been up to since the end of the Olympics. She's been working as an ambassador for Dior, Omega, and Mumm.
Mumm,
the
champagne. Nice.
Very
luxe
luxe brands. She might be heading in that direction, and it suits her.
Oh, it sounds like fun, regardless. Like after following that black line, like for many years, why not be an ambassador for Dior and Mumm? Just go for your life. And of course, her partner's Cody Simpson. So he's also stepping away from elite sport. He's had his go at it. It's a process they can perhaps share together, stepping away from swimming.
That's so romantic, Claire.
You know what they say.
We have no idea. We've not spoken to them, but that's our assumption. He's going into theatre, musical theatre, and I'm very excited to see what Emma will be up to next.
There you go.
Coming up this week, continuing the sports theme, there's a bit of sport at the moment, starting with today. It's the AFLW Grand Final between North Melbourne and Brisbane, 7:45pm Melbourne time, of course. It's a rematch of last year's final.
A rematch of last year's final. So Brisbane beat North Melbourne by 17 points last year. If they pull it off again, it will be Brisbane's 3rd consecutive grand final win. The bookies, they're tipping North Melbourne.
Oh, okay, there you go. The match is a sellout crowd too. That was a bit of controversy this week. I haven't listened to our shortcut on the AFL.
Oh, I can tell you all about it.
But there was like, should we move to a bigger venue? We're not moving to a bigger venue. We can't move to, there's something else on. It was a whole thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I will listen to that shortcut. Apologies.
Yes.
We'll pop a link to it in your episode notes if you're yet to catch up. As it's like you have to do your homework. I feel bad. You don't have to listen to it, but if you're interested, it's available.
Look, it's not compulsory.
No.
It's encouraged.
Except I think for me. I think it's compulsory for me.
I'll just note it for your performance review. That's fine.
The Women's Cricket Big Bash League final is also on this weekend. The Melbourne Renegades have booked their spot for that game. As for the other team, TBC, as we record the podcast, we don't know because it's happened last night if you're listening to this on Saturday morning.
Yeah, exactly right. That matches between the Brisbane Heat and the Sydney Thunder. So, look, Google it if you're interested. That's my advice.
We can't tell you. You'll just have to Google it. Now, you think that Spotify Wrapped might be dropping over the weekend?
Yeah, well, speaking of things that, might have happened by the time we actually get this podcast published on Saturday morning, Spotify's Wrapped, when you look back in history, it usually comes out somewhere between the 30th of November and the 6th of December.
Okay.
So, look, if that's something that you're interested in, here's some information on it.
Well, if you don't know what it is, if you're a Spotify listener or if you use Spotify, you'll get like a summary of your year of listening, your music or your podcast listening.
Yeah.
And usually it's very well shared. So you'll see it on your social media feeds and you'll hear people saying, the number one song I listened to this year was The Wiggles, which was me a couple of years ago, but it's not anymore, thank goodness. But that's what it is.
That's what it is. It's become hugely popular for Spotify. They really did sort of lead this way in this sort of aggregated data that gives you, I reckon there's one of these things, like anything that gives you a reflection of yourself.
Yeah.
Remember those quizzes on BuzzFeed?
Oh,
you go through it and it'll tell you what sort of person you are.
Yeah.
I love that stuff. I think plenty of people.
Is that why you
that
like
stuff.
star signs?
Maybe.
Yeah.
No, maybe I'm just looking for answers and reassurance. I don't know. But yeah, Spotify Wrapped. There's actually another thing that we can point you to. It's called How Bad Is Your Spotify? So when you get your Wrapped thing, you can actually send it off and this bot will tell you, basically, it's going to judge your music taste.
Oh, well, I feel like there's no judgment here. You can listen to whatever you want.
There's lots of judgment at my end. However, I think there's something cool about being daggy.
Okay, well, I'm just about to judge you because you just listen to 80s music.
More than that, I've branched out into at least the 90s this year.
It's also Cyber Monday following on from Black Friday, of course, so plenty of sales. Tuesday, it's the AIS Sports Performance Awards in Melbourne. For the Performer of the Year, there are a few contenders. These are some names you'll remember from the Olympics. Ariane Titmus.
Yes.
Kaylee McKeon.
Yep.
Saya Sakakibara
Yep.
from the BMX. She was one of my faves. Grace Brown for cycling. Lauren Parker, who was the Aussie Paralympian who won medals in both the cycling and the triathlon. They're all up for awards alongside Jed Alschwager and Nikki Ayres, who were in the mixed doubles rowing.
Yep, that's a whole list that's very, very impressive. Changing gears entirely on Friday, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's going to be in Australia. He's promoting his new memoir called Unleashed. I have a visual, when I say Unleashed and Boris Johnson, I have a very visual reaction to that because he is kind of unleashed.
Yeah,
with
he kind of is.
Whole dishevelled thing.
True.
He's going to have a long lunch in Sydney.
That seems very, very
seems
appropriate.
very,
and
very
no doubt
Boris.
there will be some attention on that. Going to read it?
Yeah, I think his writing is interesting. He's an interesting character. You can't deny it.
Can't deny it. Squiz recommends Black Friday. I got a recommendation to buy something,
Yes.
which is parent specific. Apologies, but feel like I kind of have
Don't
that
have to
role
apologise
here.
for that.
It's a recommendation from Larissa Moore, actually, who people will remember from being a host of Squiz Today and being on this podcast from time to time. It's from I'm With Kids is the brand. It's just a small, as I understand it, small Aussie brand. And they have, it's like a tray to take when you travel in the car, and your kids can put it like on their lap, and it can have their snacks, and it can have some colouring in pencils, and it has like, they can actually do colouring in, and
Does it
put all
clip
their
on
things.
to something?
Well, yeah, I think so. And
Yeah.
then it like folds over, and they
cool.
can carry it like a little suitcase.
Oh, cool.
So I'm going to recommend that.
I quite like a stable table.
Oh yeah, like if you're watching TV.
remember those,
Yeah, like
yes.
they have the are they the ones that have the like
Like a
bit at the bottom?
a stable table, it's a whole thing. It's like bean bags.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
the
Yeah, like the
beanbag
beanbag thing underneath.
yeah.
Yeah. That would work just as well. I
There
should
you
have just
go.
got a couple of those.
Couple of staple tables.
But I do like the idea that it folds up and they have to be responsible for it.
You can support a good Aussie business. That's
Exactly. So I'll
probably
put a
good
link to those in your episode notes if anyone's interested. Going on long car trips, it could be handy.
thing. It could be it's the time of year to get
Yeah.
organised with that. My recommendation, diving back into Bad Sisters, which is on Apple TV. I love the first series. The second series, it's about midway through. I'm completely gripped. I can't wait until the Friday comes around and the next episode drops.
You're
So
not alone. A few people in the office have said they really
really enjoy it. So if you haven't caught the first season, absolutely dive into that. If you haven't clocked that there's a new season, if you did watch the first one and liked it, it's good.
There you go. I think that's us done for this week. Have a great weekend. We'll chat to you next week.